Hello. This is the Freethought Forum by the Atheist Society of Knoxville and Freethought Forum and the Rationalists of East Tennessee. And we want to welcome you. And I'm Joe Barnhart.
I'm Bruce Wall, and I am in Knoxville to see Joe.
So we've got two guest speakers today.
And I'm Ruth, also visiting Joe from Chicago.
And welcome. And we want you to know that if you don't believe in God, you shouldn't be alone, and you're not. And if you do, you shouldn't be alone either. This is a free thought organization, and it's for atheists and agnostics and others who want to join with us in good, open, friendly discussion. This is a show for those and for people committed to a life rooted in science and rational thinking, freedom of supernatural beliefs. This is for a rationalist approach to religion and other viewpoints.
On today's show, we're going to talk about a human look at the Bible, or the Bible as a human production.
Yeah, a human production of the Bible, and that's going to take some time.
First, we want to tell you a little bit about the sponsors of our show. The Atheist Society of Knoxville frequently has a fun meet-up at a bar or eatery. Tonight's meet-up is at Barley's in the Old City, starting around 5:30. Look for the silver-jacketed copy of
The God Delusion.
Yeah. Standing upright on the table. And as Matt Dillahunty at Atheist Experience says, everyone is welcome to our happy hour for food, drink, and conversation. But if you plan to preach, proselytize, provoke, or punch, please don't.
Please don't.
The Rationalists of East Tennessee have several regular monthly meetings. The first and third Sunday mornings of the month are usually lectures with lively roundtable discussions. The second Sunday, we hold the Skeptics Book Club. On the fourth Sunday, we are mixing it up, sometimes with a get-together we call a Reflections meeting. It features a potluck lunch in someone's home. Sometimes we meet to play board games or similar activities.
Very good. Yeah, okay. And later in the show, we'll give you our website and visit for additional details, including times and locations. And now we want to move to the program, Atheism, and especially the subtitle is a human look at the Bible. And I've got two guest speakers who are going to deal with this, and then we'll do a little process thinking in this. In case you're just tuning in, this is a Freethought Forum, a program for the Atheist Society of Knoxville and the Rationalists of East Tennessee, and it's funded by these. And do that one, would you? Shows are live most every Tuesday from 5 to 6 p.m. Eastern on Community Access Television Channel 6 or Channel 12, depending on your cable network. Tell your out-of-town friends to see us streaming online at ctvknox.org. Yeah, it is a call-in show, so we want to be encouraging you to call in for good, open discussion, and we try to respect each other, but communicate information back and forth. And on the screen you can see how to do this, and call now and we will try to get to you during the information break and that sort of thing. So now let's see if we can, we need to move into the program, Okay. Free thought means open inquiry. can you make open inquiry into the Bible? Give me some of the background of where you come from, Ruth, on this issue and similar. Did you grow up, an agnostic, an atheist, or Hindu, or what?
No, I grew up very conservative Baptist in New Jersey, extremely fundamentalist. And so my journey is long and took a long time and is interesting.
Yeah. So it took years to move.
Right.
Yeah. And
right.
Were you a missionary or?
Well, my parents became missionaries when I was 16. They went from a business world to a Chinese school in Manila, Philippines, to teach in the Chinese school. So I was at age 16 with my brother 13 and started a new life of 3 years in the Philippines at a Chinese school and then at the University of the Philippines. And the purpose of the school was to be evangelistic, to convert Catholics and Buddhists to evangelical Christianity.
Oh, we could.
But I was a kid and I had a ball.
I bet you did.
So that was just a happy time of freedom and playing, but mostly being exposed to another culture. Filipino friends, Chinese friends, that I think has been invaluable in my life. So I am very grateful. It was my fundamentalist period, but I'm very grateful for that particular 3 years.
By being with another culture, that makes you look back at your own culture, doesn't it?
Yeah, what it did more was to make me comfortable when I became a social worker in Chicago in poor areas. With going to the projects and being with many people from other cultures, I was just so comfortable. And I think it was, the Philippines gave me a taste for adventure and for meeting other people from other cultures. And I found doing social work, even with people who are very poor, very exciting and gratifying as well. So that was the positive part.
Okay, yeah. Being in another culture lets you appreciate what that culture was like.
Exactly.
And learning it from the inside.
Right.
And that's hard to do.
Yeah.
Anthropologists work hard on doing that.
I think being a 16-year-old made it easier. It's still.
Yeah, you're more open then, aren't you? Yeah.
Right. And the Chinese kids and the Filipino kids became very good friends.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
It was exciting and wonderful. So that was the benefit of being a fundamentalist at that time.
At that time, you got to go to another country.
Exactly. Yeah.
And what kind of background did you have then?
Well, I was born and raised in Kenya, in East Africa, as a missionary kid. My parents had gone out there to evangelize. They were fundamentalists. My mother and father. The second time they met was at the first fundamentalist conference in 1929 in Philadelphia. So they were part of the beginnings of fundamentalism in this country. But at the time, it was a movement, a world-claiming movement in their terms. And so they went out to Africa as missionaries. And I grew up taking it all for granted. I would say I grew up in the Bible bubble. And when I came to the States when I was 15, and then my folks went back, and I went down to North Carolina to live with my aunt and my grandmother, and that's where I met my first atheist or agnostic who had some questions about what I had taken for granted all my life, and. That started me on this journey of questioning, and I have been on it ever since. And that's what brought me down here to Knoxville to see you.
You came here to me because of a book you had read. Yeah.
Well, I grew, like I said, I grew up. The Bible was the answer to everything, right? There are no questions because you've got all the answers. And so at one point in my life, I just dropped the whole thing. Well, that was a long way into the story. I went to a Bible college and seminary, and I studied the Bible, and I went to the University of Chicago in Germany to study the Bible. So it took me a long time to break out of that bubble. And for a while, I just said, that's it. In fact, I spent 25 years in the computer industry, as far away as you can get from from a Bible world. And then I realized that there was a lot that I had left behind, and that the Bible, in fact, is, as the title of this talk says, this show, the Bible is actually a human book. It was written by human beings.
By human beings.
Okay, it's human.
Like the Iliad and like the Homer's
exactly.
Iliad.
So
Like
why do we leave it aside, or can we leave it aside, or should we leave it aside? Should we just say, well, this is none of us, this is not ours, but this is actually part of what it means to be human.
So you're saying if you read the Bible, you really learn a lot of revelation, but it's mostly about human beings.
It's exactly.
Now that makes a lot of sense to me. Just to say you throw the Bible out is a little bit like saying throw out part of human history because you don't agree with all of it. Well, I had a teacher once said in class, don't think that everybody before you came along is a damn fool or was a damn fool, you know?
Yeah.
In other words, just because people held to some weird or strange ideas in the past doesn't mean that everything they had to say is totally stupid. So wipe it all out and don't learn anything from it and start from scratch.
Yep.
His view is that's what you'll have is scratch.
Well, and so the specific prompt that got me here was about 2 years ago. I realized that I wanted to produce. I wanted to talk about how to think about the Bible in the 21st century, and I want to mention a specific point of view that some of you may have towards the Bible. A few years ago, the UN general, who had been in charge of the peacekeeping force in Rwanda in 1994, was speaking in Chicago after this terrible ordeal that he had been through. He had been in charge of a force that could not keep the peace, and therefore he was responsible for watching the genocide take place. And he was speaking in Chicago about that experience, but one of the stories that he told, the most shocking to me, was that after the genocide, the government in Rwanda declared a formal moratorium on teaching history.
On teaching history?
Because the history that was being taught there was a provocation to genocide. And so they said, we've got to stop that. We've got to rethink our history before we start teaching it again.
So he was asking for a critical approach to history?
Well, they wanted to look at what they were saying was their history, and so I'm suspecting that there are some out in this audience who might feel the same way about the Bible, that the Bible is a provocation to violence. I know there are people who feel that way.
Well, there is a good case study. This is the case. For example, when the Puritans over here, quoting the Bible, now, I don't think the Puritans were all irrational people. They came over here in New England cold as heck and survived. So they had a lot of common sense. But like a lot of us, with common sense, we also have a lot of stupid ideas. That doesn't mean we're all stupid. It means some of our ideas are stupid. They had some stupid ideas, one of which is since Joshua had been commanded of the Lord to exterminate Edomites and others, they could then do what they wanted and steal the land of some of the natives. They thought this was a divine imperative, quote unquote. And someone once said history is a big pool of water, and you can dip where you want to get what you want.
Exactly.
And of course, that's not what rational historical inquiry is. That's using history for your own purposes.
Right, exactly. Well, last week we were on vacation with part of our family. And one of the relatives who had been brought up in the same Bible bubble and had started to break away, we were waiting, we had a 2-hour wait for supper. So she cornered me and she started talking, and that was the story she told. Is there a story in the Bible about God commanding this destruction of the people? I said, yep. But so that's part of the Bible, and there are people who have just tossed the whole thing out because of these kinds of stories. They're there.
Well, your approach on the human approach to the Bible is when people use the Bible,
Yeah.
would you say it tells us a lot about them?
Exactly.
How they use the Bible.
Yeah.
In other words, there are passages that said, love your neighbor as yourself. Okay, that's good. There are other passages, but that tells you about the person who uses these passages to support his own ideology in the first place.
Yeah.
In that sense, that seems to me is not reading the Bible. That's reading yourself
Yeah.
into the Bible.
Yes.
And for one thing, the Bible's not one book. It's a whole library.
Well, one of the things I told her was it's a collection of writings that were produced over a period of almost 1,000 years. And so to try to pin down one part of that as if it were all part of a single point of view is like trying to take a collection of writings from American history starting with 1600 and putting them together and
That's
saying,
a good point.
right, as if that were a single view of America.
Yeah, and we have this today. People saying, well, the American view,
Right.
and then they give you their interpretation
Right.
of you know, and we all give an interpretation. That's why we need to look at different interpretations and criticize each other, trying to find out what really happened
Yeah.
in the past, which is not easy to do.
Yeah.
Right.
And the same with trying to find out what really took place in the Bible periods is not because we worship Moses, if there was such a person at all,
Exactly.
or worship Jesus, how many Jesuses there were at that time,
Right.
but really to find out what was going on when they created these stories.
Right.
Would you agree the word
Exactly.
creation is?
Yes, it's very important. And in the last couple hundred years, there has been what I call a contextual revolution, this enormous discovery of evidence of the actual biblical world, the surrounding environment. 500,000 texts from the ancient world of the Bible. Now, the way we were brought up, the way we were taught, the Bible sort of emerged out of nowhere, just like
dropped in,
creation was creation out of nothing. So, you know, the Bible was the oldest book, was the book written by God, and the Israelites and Jesus came out of heaven. Well, the discoveries, the archaeological discoveries from Babylon and the Middle East are overwhelmingly the surrounding world out of which the Bible emerged, and bringing the Bible back down to earth, planting it in human history as a part of human history, as one part of that larger story. There's a historian, Ian Morris, who's written one of these grand updates on what used to be called Western civilization. He's at Stanford, and he has written a book, Why the West is Ahead for Now. It's the first comprehensive effort to tell the story of not just Western civilization,
But these other
global human history. Well, biblical history plays a small role in that history of his, but that's the history I'm trying to plant. This particular set of writings that have been lifted, torn out of their roots.
torn out of the roots.
You know, and plant it back in and find out what these people were like, these societies that produced this kind of these writings.
So what would your mother say to this?
Oh, help. No, she would be very traditional.
Yeah.
And, you know, God wrote it. He dictated to Moses. He dictated to all these writers at that time, and they wrote it down. Very traditional.
Yeah.
Well, let me add to that. My daughter was married in a Unitarian church in Chicago, and Ruth's mother and father were sitting right in front of us during the ceremony.
Right.
And the minister at one point said to the congregation, "There is no rule book for marriage." And I could see her mother getting ready to jump up and say, yes, there is.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's what she would have said
Yeah,
to my ideas.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah, you could say for marriage, if you can define marriage, then you can say that's a structure, and all structures have limits as to what can and cannot be done.
Yeah.
And that's true of cooking,
Right.
anything. But that's different from saying you had the divine cookbook.
Right, right. I mean, you know, we learn.
So you're saying the Bible's basically a human book.
Yeah, and that means that we learn, you know, that it's a record of what I would call trial and error or experiment.
Trial and that's what real thinking is. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And if we start looking at it that way, it turns out to be really an interesting
That's
history.
what I like. And the reason I like reading the Bible is because I'm basically interested in human development.
Right.
I'm an evolutionist, and I think ideas evolve.
Exactly.
And you have chance variation, and some of them get selected.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm interested in what the environment is that selects ideas. Part of it's politics.
Yeah.
Part of it's murder. So in reading the Bible, you see how ideas get selected and suppressed. Mm-hmm. And you read other histories and you see, human beings do the same thing in other cultures too.
Yeah.
And maybe this ought to tell us a little bit more about our own culture rather than exempt ourselves so much from the human race. Mm-hmm. Because I want to know, well, right now I go to, you and I mentioned this, I go to a supermarket in control of a corporation, and I can't determine how much I paid for oranges per pound at this particular supermarket. I get all this talk about rewards, and they talk how much they saved me. They didn't save me 1 penny. So what I'm saying is this is sheer fiction. Our culture is loaded with as much fiction as you have in the Bible.
You know, you've given me my opening for jumping to one of the reasons why I have gone back to the Bible. It's to understand that particular example of a kind of thinking that I would call fundamentalism. And as an example, it's something that we need to learn is not confined to religion.
Exactly.
There is something called market fundamentalism, which has nothing to do with the Bible or traditional religion. It has to do with what you called corporatism. And market fundamentalism, that's not an exaggeration. My definition of fundamentalism is somebody who's taken part of the world or part of a particular point of view. The economists study the market.
I got you.
The market's part of the rest of society. If you and economists are brilliant at analyzing how the market works. But if they turn their analysis of the market into the whole thing, then they're verging on fundamentalism. They've taken a part for the whole, and they've forgotten the fact that they had extracted that part out in the first place.
What does the economy say?
And I've got a niece who thinks that religious fundamentalism is the biggest threat. I've been trying to convince her that, as far as I'm concerned, the biggest threat to our democracy is secular forms of fundamentalism.
Secular fundamentalism.
So you got me on a rant there.
On a rant. Well, communism is a good example.
Yeah.
Communism is as much a fundamentalism. What you have in the fundamentalism, I mean, in communism, the Lebensmacht, the life force, and it acts as if it were a divine drive. And then you've got the dialectical principle, and it looks like it acts as if it's a divine revelation. And rather than critically and empirically and rationally analyzing what they're talking about, then this starts being laid out as if it's some kind of divine truth.
Yeah.
And I'm saying the culture is riddled with this sort of thing. And we need, in other words, by studying the mistakes in the past that my species has made, that can tell us a lot about ourselves today. We haven't outgrown. We've simply changed the language somewhat, but we do this very, very same, and that's why it's so important. That's why I like the rationalists of East Tennessee group. They say you got to analyze and examine these things. I mean, when they talk about physics, they don't just take it as divine revelation. They want to know what do they mean by particles? What do they mean by waves?
Have you heard of the invisible gorilla?
Yeah, go ahead. You talk about.
Have you heard it?
Yeah, you talk about it.
It's an experiment by a social cognitive psychologist. In fact, he got his degree at Cornell University, where my son did, and the two of them got to know each other while he was generating this experiment. And the experiment shows a video of two teams. One team dressed in white, the other team dressed in black, and they're passing a ball, two balls, back and forth to each other. And as the video is shown for 2 minutes, a person is sitting there watching it and is told, count the number of passes made by the white team. That's all you're supposed to do for the next 2 minutes. Count the number of passes. Well, in the middle of the video, a person dressed in a gorilla suit walks onto the stage, right into the middle, turns, faces the audience, beats his chest, and then walks off. Afterwards, they ask the person who's watching how many passes were made by the white team. And they give a number, and then the next question is, did you notice the gorilla? Half the people that they've shown this to don't see the gorilla. The fundamentalists declare there was no gorilla because they didn't see it. So fundamentalism says, if I didn't see it, it's not part of the universe, and
and all of us have this aspect in us. That's what the point is. And that's why it's a mistake to pick one group of people and say, I'm so glad I'm not like these idiots, because there's idiocy in all of us, and that's why I need other people to help correct me when I make idiotic statements. Now, if they do it politely, I don't get so offended. But if they can do it diplomatically, I can save face and then go home and say, you know, I did make a fool of myself, didn't I? And you can tell yourself better than that. And you can.
It's wonderful,
Yeah, and it's so helping people to see. I've often, when I used to go to these meetings on capitalism and the debates among them, who's a true capitalist?
Right.
And it sounded just like me, who's a true Christian?
Yeah.
You see?
Absolutely.
And I tried to say, okay, let's try to figure out, when I was talking with them, let's see how we're just using the word. Okay, you have capitalism definition A. You have capitalism B. You have capitalism C. Each of you are using the word true, but you obviously have different uses of the word.
Absolutely.
And so we're going to find out now, what are we really talking about other than just a definition, and to get into the meat of it rather than just the word of it.
Yes.
And I find often studying religion, then I look at other groups and I see the very same thing, because we're just human beings.
Yeah, and you know, one of the strengths of that ability, going back to the invisible gorilla,
is
the first time I talked about that, I was stressing the fact that what I just said before, that they missed the gorilla, and so in fact the cognitive psychologists who show this tend to show this and take the lesson that how selective our vision is. How selective our knowledge. We think we see what's going on, but in fact there's an awful lot that they miss. The next, as I was talking about that, I realized our ability to do that, to focus, to limit our attention, is one of the great gifts of being human. Rather than just being so flooded with everything that we can't pick out anything.
Well, you can't think
right?
if you're flooded.
So there's a value to being able to focus, to concentrate, to specialize. The academy is full of specialists. That's one of the gifts of human development.
Would you agree that science built in as part of its institution,
Yeah.
along with this selectivity,
Exactly.
which is mistakenly called empiricism, but I won't get into that, but also falsification,
Yes.
in which we actually want scientists, well, scientists can't be scientists as an institution unless they have scientists who are actually working to try to refute
Right.
the theories.
Yes, exactly.
Now that's...
When a scientist comes up with a theory, the next scientist is gonna and shows an experiment that proves it or has evidence. The next scientist who comes along is going to do exactly what you just said. Well, let's see if I can reproduce that, right?
And I'll quote you my favorite philosopher. He says, "Let your theories die for you." They're more where they come from.
Yeah.
Don't die with your theories.
Yeah, yeah.
Because you're and I old enough to know we've had theories to die. I've got graveyards of
Yeah.
theories that just didn't work.
Yeah.
And, they're dear to me. But I've buried them because I have to admit that didn't explain as much as I thought.
Yeah.
And so if you can correct my theory,
Yes.
it hurts my ego, but you're not attacking my ego, you're just attacking my theory, and
Yes.
I need to learn to disengage.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a great. I mean, I want to pick up on that because a lot of the debate about evolution, which you brought up, talks about the theory of evolution. People say it was just a theory.
Yeah.
Somebody comes back and says, well, it's not just a theory. And so you end up in a debate about whether it's a theory or not. But a scientist who believes in evolution is not debating the theory. They're using the theory to do just what we were talking about. Find evidence for this particular piece of it or that particular piece of it. So scientists are not spending their time arguing about theory. They're using the theory to test each other's
I like
ideas.
the way you put it. What I call getting evidence for the theory to prove it, I think is myth.
Yeah.
Now, I know this is a little radical, but I think what's called collecting evidence to prove a theory is pure fiction. What it is, you collect evidence to keep putting the theory together.
You're using the theory.
And you're putting it together, tighten it up, and then you try to falsify it.
Right. Right.
And then I would say you have not proved your theory. What you've done is it still stands up after severe criticism. See, I want to keep, it still stands and you go with it.
Yeah.
But it still may be a false theory because another one may come along and shoot it down, or there may be a better one that I haven't even thought of yet.
But I'm going to add one more piece to that, which is that in that whole process, a good theory has proved its usefulness by its fruitfulness.
I love it.
It's produced new insight, new knowledge. We understand things better than we did before. We understand the causes of diseases better than before, regardless of whether the theory's been proved or not.
I like that. That's a good pragmatic approach.
Yes, exactly.
In other words, there still may be better theories,
right.
But so far, this is the best we have. Stay with it. Try to shoot it down.
Why is it the best?
Because we don't have any others.
And it's because this one's useful.
Working. It's working.
Fruitful.
Yeah, that's what I like about pragmatism. It's fruitful. It produces, one, you can make predictions, and they still hold up. And therefore you say, well, it's a fruitful theory. And then you can say, well, maybe I can develop another theory connected with it into another area.
Or I can come up with an experiment based on that theory that will, again, prove it or not prove it, but the experiment may produce new knowledge.
Exactly.
And that's how I look at the Bible. The Bible was a human experiment.
Exactly.
It was a thought experiment when you're looking back at it. Is it fruitful or not?
And would you say some parts of it, when I read it, I say, the guy was on to something. And when I read the Apostle Paul, I don't buy his theology. But I see the guy is working with the fact he's in a community where you've got to have rules and regulations and guidelines.
Yeah.
Okay. But there are other aspects of life too you got to live with. So how do you balance the rules and guidelines? You got criminals, you see, and you still have to have rules. That's the Torah he's dealing with.
So are you saying that Paul was struggling with problems that we have?
Exactly. In fact, I think our penal system could learn a lot from this guy without his theology. You don't need his theology. See what he's trying to work through with the theories he had at his, because, see, I interpret the word God to mean community. You see, that's just, I'll just say, community says this, community says that. Community gives you grace, doesn't it?
Yes.
You know, I do
Amen.
things wrong, destructive sometimes, and the community still accepts me. It's not a supernatural thing. So every time I see the word God, I said, well, that's community, and it's fallible. You know, community has to change and modify. And when I read history of theology, I see theories of God change because the communities.
Now you mentioned Paul, and one of the things you say about Paul in your book is that Paul was thinking.
Thinking, yeah.
Well,
Yeah,
that's one of the claims about Paul that you don't see very often.
oh, yeah.
That he was thinking.
Well, he talks about going up to the third heaven. Now, that's all baloney. But you see the problems he's working with. He's trying to think through how are you going to live in a law of structure and law and order, and still there needs to be forgiveness and grace and a second chance in life. Now, you've got to balance this out. And that's what these communities were doing. They were talking about God all the time, but they're really struggling with how do you keep the community going without their killing each other off and lying themselves. I mean, that's why I like to study corporations.
Yeah.
And I think corporations sometimes do an incredible amount of lying and get away with it. And then, you know, call it advertisement and what all of this. But I won't get off into that. But when I study theology and I study corporatology, I see lots of similarities going on here. And I'm not a. And when I studied Karl Marx, I had at Harvard I studied Marxism, and my teacher saw the similarities between fundamentalism religion and Marxism, and he was right on target. And I said to myself, I'm glad he studied fundamentalist religion because he did not get suckered in. Now, my difference with my teacher at Harvard is he saw through the economic theory of Marxism as it just didn't work.
Yeah.
And that was in the 50s. What he didn't understand, in my opinion, that Karl Marx did understand some of the psychology of the working class. And I don't think this professor had to work for his hands, with his hands enough, and with bosses that are, you know, just belligerent. And I think when Marx talked about the products of our work being alienated from us, some workers don't have any identity with their work, you know, and I think I know what he was talking about, and I didn't think my professor did because his work was so meaningful to him. I mean, he had his whole personality in his book. In fact, he read his book in class as his lecture, word for word. And it was beautifully done. Now, that's amazing.
Yeah.
I mean, I could see this was a work of art. And I don't think this professor really understood that a lot of people in those factories didn't necessarily think of their work as works of art. They were alienated from a lot of their work.
Yeah.
Now, some people I've noticed who work with their hands, they're like the professor. I mean, I had an uncle once that'd stand back, and his name was Theodore, and he'd say, "Good job, Theodore," because he had worked with his brain and his thumbs and his fingers to create what I couldn't do. And And I think Marx understood that some workers didn't have that in their situation. So what I'm saying is I can learn even from Karl Marx, even though I think his economic solution is just, just bonkers. And I'm not. In fact, I had a teacher who had been a missionary, but he in 1950 something said, communism in China. This is 1950s. He says, I know we think communism is going to survive and take over China, but it's not going to have a chance. Eventually, Taoism will overcome. And I thought, looking back, this guy knew. I understand why he was saying Taoism had a long tradition of problem solving, trying to deal with nature. In a much more rational way.
Well, to jump to another example, I ended up in the computer business for 25 years. Out of all of this, after all this Bible study. And after 3 years in the computer business, full, just throwing myself in, back in the 90s, and the 90s was the dot-com boom, and I was caught up, I got in '84, and I discovered that I was in a culture that had another fundamentalist belief in technology. Wendell Berry, who is a farmer from somewhere down south, Kentucky or Tennessee, tobacco farmer and a writer. I read an essay of his, Why I Do Not Use a Computer. And then I read an essay later of his where he talked about technological fundamentalism, meaning that technology is going to save us. And I was in the middle of this
revolution,
this culture, this revolution. So I think that there's a way. It's another example of taking one part of the universe as if it's the whole story.
It's the whole the key.
And I think that one's pretty much alive in this culture today, in parts of our society that are far closer to us and far more disturbing to me than communism.
Well, you and I talked about this, the wonders of technology in the service station business.
Sure.
Remember? I mean, now you can go to the service station and you don't have to fool with someone cleaning your windshield. Well, you can get out and clean your own windshield. And if you're an 85-year-old woman, you can fill your own tires. Because we've got the technology for this 85-year-old woman to go out.
I haven't tried that.
To do it herself.
To do it herself.
Wow.
And if you're on a phone, you don't need to have somebody to help you. You can listen to 14 recordings and then solve the problem. So there's a good example of being suckered in by all this technology, but it's not critical technology.
Exactly,
And I think that's what we can learn by studying people who use the Bible and not looking at it critically and not seeing it from your point of view. I can see it as it's a human book, seeing how they wrestled with their problems, and you use the word trial and error. So see how they made their mistakes with a lot of their views of.
Well, and one of the practical ways this turns out to affect the study of the Bible, or how to think about the Bible. Again, I've had friends who want to know where should I begin reading it? How should I think about it? And they may know about the Old Testament, they may know about the New Testament, but they don't know where this came from. They don't know where the human writers came from, who the human writers were, and so there are ways to come and look at the trial and error from the human point of view that are available today, as a result of a lot of the thinking and interest being taken by sociologists, economists, archaeologists, historians of the Near East, of the Middle East, of Egypt.
If our culture had not been influenced greatly by this tradition, then some people would say it would be right, see, why waste time thinking about it?
Yeah, exactly.
But I'm not in denial about this. This tradition, from biblical tradition, has had a major influence on our culture, and it's been redefined and reused, but it's still there.
Yeah, exactly.
In different language, and we need to understand it better to see how it's still having an impact.
Exactly.
Rather than being in denial.
Yeah.
Because being in denial is pretending we know more than we really know.
Yeah.
And to understand that culture is to understand how we go through the same process of fooling ourselves more than we sometimes think.
Yeah.
And
Go ahead.
Well, okay, well, can I jump in?
Yeah, please.
How I come into this with all you're talking about is your title, Bring the Bible Back to Earth, and emphasizing the humanness. And mine is a personal story, and I think anybody out there listening from my background, I think will understand a lot of this, well, my personal story. But my personal story parallels your bringing the Bible back to earth and the humanness into me becoming a human being, as opposed to something else. And so this is personal. That's all I have to share.
But go ahead. In other words, you're not giving your life to a deity.
Right. I have 3 stages in my life. The first stage, the first third, was everything with God. This is Baptist fundamentalist surrender, service, all of that. Everything is God, and our core is evil. And this is, I'm not alone in having heard this. Millions of people out there.
Original sin, yeah.
Yes. And the core is just absolutely garbage, frankly.
Yeah.
And I lived with that understanding, which was preached very specifically, that my core is evil. And therefore, I have to find God out there. And there was no self. There was no agency. I of course, didn't commit suicide, so it wasn't that bad, but I was constantly not honoring or recognizing that I had any kind of agency, because that's what evil is. So that's the first 30 years. And the reason we're still married is that I had my issues also with this understanding of the theory of salvation and Christianity. Second stage was I couldn't maintain that. Eventually I said, I am smothering, I am dying. There's no room for me in this universe with that kind of a God who is crushing me and saying, you're no good, worship me. Constantly surrender yourself. So for the next 20 years, I was searching for myself, and which had been systematically put down and tried to eliminate in my understand how I work. So that was 20 years. And I did not go to church for 20 years. I would walk in and walk out because he saved a wretch like me. I mean, and again, fundamentalists will understand this. So after 20 years, I began to think, this isn't working either. I'm a little lonely.
Sure.
When you've grown up with such a full, rich community of Christians, believe it, it's worldwide, it's warm, there is community. And when you decide that that's not working, and it happened for me over in Germany, it's very isolating. You feel as if you're falling into outer space, because I was in a bubble also. So you leave that bubble and you feel as if you're falling in free fall. And that's where I was for the next few years. Say, I can't survive. There's no room in this universe for that God and me. So he has to go. Either I die or he goes. I'm tired of dying. He's going. So I pushed that God out of my life and found myself. Now, that was my job for the next 20 years, is to find that I had
that
agency.
Concept,
that I had not even acceptance, just.
Okay, so, let's see if we got a caller here. We will come back on that. We have a caller. Come in. Let's hear what you have to say. Go.
Hey, it's Charles from Central Illinois.
Oh, good, Charles. Let's hear from you.
Okay, how do people deal with the what was it? The Bible that they made a mistake, a King James version, repent of the King James version. Well, they left out the not in the commandment about thou shalt not commit adultery?
I give up. What you're making a point, so make it real clearly so I could understand what you're talking about. Okay.
How do the people that hold it as a divine inspired word deal with the fact that an entire set of Bibles were printed without the word not in the commandment and thou shalt not commit adultery?
So do you know of a translation that does that? Now, there's a passage in the Bible that says, thou shalt not bear false witness. Are you with me? That means
Yes.
don't lie. So can you tell me? Can you tell me a Bible that says thou shalt commit adultery?
Yes, there was a modern day printing
Yeah.
where they made the mistake of leaving out the word not
Yeah.
in that commandment.
It was a mistake.
It was a mistake.
Okay. Now, what's the point you're making? I've forgotten.
If the inspired word of God can be commandment from God can be accidentally changed like that, how come there wasn't any idea that that thing could have happened many times before, especially since we don't have the original?
Okay, I got you. As a matter of fact, we're thinking that you may have a really good point to make if I'm understanding you. I don't want to put words in your mouth. But I think that you use the word translation. I don't want to fudge, so you hold me my feet to the fire. And I think you maybe want to say something.
No, go ahead.
That we all, in some respects, are translating various things, Bible or otherwise. Are you with me?
Yes.
And sometimes we translate it to what we want it to be.
Yes.
Okay.
But this was not intentional.
Right.
And
but it was a
since
mistake.
we don't have the originals, we don't know if the ones we have, which only date back to around the 1100s, that being the oldest version we have apparently, if it's anything like the true original.
You're talking about 1100 AD or BC now?
AD.
Oh, no, we have manuscripts much earlier than that. Okay.
Yes.
But anyhow, we have many manuscripts, and we can put them all together to try to figure out which we conjecture, and I want to use this word, were the earliest ones. Are you with me?
Yes.
We can do that, but it's still a conjecture. I will give you that. Now, anyhow, go ahead. You were making a point. I didn't mean to interrupt.
Well, it sounds like you're also pointing out that in the course of the copying of those originals and the translating, that mistakes were made, and so that what we're reading today are not the originals and are not free of error, right?
Yes.
And so this particular example you showed was simply one more example of that kind of mistake that's being made in the copying and the publishing of what people read today as the inerrant, infallible Bible from God.
Yes.
There's a problem with that. That's exactly right, because what that says is that the Bible is not a human book. And we're on this program today talking about the fact that that is one view of the Bible that simply, for reasons that you're pointing out, doesn't fit the facts, right?
Correct. All the different fightings and wars and so forth of the earlier centuries, plus political agendas.
Yeah.
Such as King James's fear of witches.
So are you suggesting what we're trying to say, or at least what I'm trying to say here, is that that particular notion of the Bible, which is so widespread and so popular, is one that we need, those of us who say that's not the way it worked, that we need to put out a different story about that set of writings, a human story about that set of writings. That's what our agenda is this afternoon, as I understand this program. And it sounds like you're on board for that.
Oh, yes.
Well, would you agree, sir, that there has never been a time in which all books of the Bible in the original version have ever been collected together as one book? The original.
That, I think, the closest that was happened is when the Catholic Church got the Vulgate Bible,
No,
I think it's pronounced.
The Vulgate is not even the ball game. It's all translations of translations of translations. Okay.
Yeah. And that's one of my principal points. We don't have anything like the originals. We don't have anything.
Exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
No question about it.
So even what the original in Greek and Hebrew, we still don't have the originals.
Right.
We have copies of copies of copies, and from
translations of copies.
And translations of copies into different languages.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
And your point is maybe there are possibilities of mistakes.
Mistakes, mistranslations, and political agendas. Okay? From the powers that be that could not accept something that didn't support their view and had it
well, we do know
rewritten to slightly emphasize their position.
Oh, well, you got a good point. When I think it was Michael Civitas came up with a view of God, just a view of God. He wasn't a radical in any, overwhelming sense. A view of God and Jesus. That Jesus was not God, and that the early Christians didn't worship God. That was his view. Calvin had him to put to death. He didn't argue with him,
Yeah.
You try to shoot a guy's idea down, not him. But Calvin had him executed.
Yep.
Yeah, I understand, but I can't confirm that Isaac Newton studied the Bible and came to the conclusion that Jesus was not, in fact, Jesus.
You are right.
Who was God, and he was subordinate to God.
Yeah, he was more of a Unitarian rather than a Trinitarian in his tradition.
Yeah.
Yes, you are dead right on that. Yeah. If you can pardon the pun.
Because of all the differences he found in the Bible and the New Testament versus what people were stating as a Trinitarian.
So could we summarize, you say, that the Bible, being a human book, can be subject to mistakes?
And mistranslations and political agendas and so forth.
Absolutely.
And misinterpretations.
Yes.
And that's true of any book. Even a great science book can be misinterpreted. Or
misunderstood completely.
Exactly.
A lot of people do that with the works of Einstein and the thermodynamics and so forth.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I remember Einstein went to hear Karl Popper speak at Princeton. I thought that was interesting. And he did it because Popper had taught scientists to learn to criticize each other. And he said, Popper says he learned from Einstein, and he admired Einstein for making predictions so clear that they might be falsifiable.
Exactly.
They might be, or you could test them.
Yep.
Well, apparently, is it moving toward our time to leave? Am I mistaken? How much time? So it's not only the time break, time closing. So
yeah.
Ruth.
Okay.
Ruth, we would like to thank our viewers, Ruth, could do what?
We would like to thank our viewers and send our thanks to Sam and Jonas for technical support, to the staff at CTV Knox, and to all our callers.
Visit our websites, www.rationalist.org and www.knoxvilleatheists, that's a mouthful, .org.
And be with us.
We are the fastest growing religious group in America.